The room was dipped into a dim, slightly blue light that caused a cozy atmosphere for its occupants as they knelt around the large table that was filled with all kinds of pleasantries imported directly from their comparatively close homeworld. Every meal had been cooked with meticulous precision, allowing to both see and taste the effort that the chefs had gone through to prepare it. The room itself was as noble and decorated as the food. The walls were covered in panels of wood which were painted with lovely murals of cows reaching their trunks up high to harvest fruit from ziflar trees, while the comically oversized depiction of a bull stood guard in the foreground, seemingly keeping a watchful eye on anyone looking at the painting. Right now, that meant that the painted man was staring down two of his corporeal counterparts. The table was oriented in a way that left one of its longer sides aligned along the wall, meaning only the three remaining sides were usable as spaces to eat. The Nafmir dual friend was sitting next to each other on the side that directly faced the mural, avoiding it to look at each other as well as they could as they focused either on their plates or on the women of their favour, who sat at the two shorter sides of the table respectively, with their dual friend sitting closer to their side than the other one. Much unlike those two, Agifionora and Magisteria were not only directly facing each other, but also made regular eye contact, or simply threw deliberate glances over at each other. While the atmosphere at the table was undeniably a little bit tense for everyone involved, none of them could forget about the manners that they had learned all their life, part of which was to constantly assure the person across from you that you were looking out for them, or, historically, that you were looking out for what was behind them while they faced you. The first hour or so of the meeting had of course been spent exchanging pleasantries, and catching up with shallow small talk during arrival and waiting for their meal to be brought, and the next half an hour at least had been used to quietly eat to raise the mood with good food, as nobody wanted to address heavy topics on an empty stomach. However, now that the first hunger was quelled and mouths remained empty for long enough to be used to form words again, Agifionora could see how her mother shifted slightly, as her energy changed a bit, cluing her into the fact that things were about to become a lot less surface level than they had been up until now. And as if she had known it, her mother soon enough spoke up while idly gesturing with the long fork she held, wrapped in one of the ends of her trunk. "So," she said, finally breaking the silence while lifting her head to look directly into her daughter's eyes, "how long has this little collaboration of yours been going on? I know, of course, that you and the ambassador had met a few times in the past. However, I wasn't aware that you two were in such close contact. How come you never mentioned it?" She tilted her head a bit, as if to already prod for an answer, even though she had barely asked her question. Agifionora returned her gaze directly, though in the corner of her vision she could see how her dual friend occasionally stole a couple of glances back and forth between her and her mother, seeming a bit tense now that the evening was entering its metaphorical hot phase. "It would be the first time that you have been all too worried about who I am in correspondence with since I finished my first uniform year," she replied, while her tone of voice made it entirely apparent that she was jesting. She then paused, leaving a brief moment for a polite chuckle before continuing. "But in all honesty, my correspondence with James hasn't been continuous since his stay on Ostnijar. In fact, it only started back up very recently, during a time when you were already exceptionally busy and rarely home. I understand why you may have wanted me to inform you about it, but I felt like it was in neither of our best interests." Her mother's head perked up a bit as she briefly pointed the prongs of her fork in Agifionora's direction. "May have wanted you to inform me," she repeated her daughter's words, with a slightly heightened, questioning tone. "That's a bit of an understatement, don't you think?" Although her tone remained casual and polite, there was a clear undertone of accusation coming along with it. That wasn't exactly unexpected, of course. "I didn't want you to get unnecessarily upset," Agifionora replied, keeping her own voice polite yet firm in its convictions. "I understand that you had, and maybe still have, qualms with James. However, it was never my intention to go against you. I have told you from day one that I thought there must have been Some sort of enormous misunderstanding between James and Auntie Apo. I simply wish to try my best to possibly clear it up, as someone who James has shown some understanding and respect for in the past. Of course, a lot of those things were only partially true at this point, as her understanding of the situation had changed a lot in recent times. But she wasn't just going to shove that into her mother's trunk if she could avoid it. Magisteria sighed deeply, and her trunk sunk down to the point that the prongs of her fork clinked against the table's plate.
Agifionora, your desire for peace and understanding in all honours. But that man killed your father, she said.
She didn't quite raise her voice, but there was a definite trace of emotion that wasn't entirely hidden by her tone that time. Agifionora suppressed a grimace, though she couldn't help but let her gaze dip down briefly, breaking eye contact. She scolded herself internally because, while it wasn't done in shame, she was sure her mother might very well interpret it that way.
That is not technically true,
she very weakly countered first, knowing fully well that even James willingly took the responsibility for the former door friend's death when asked, even if he wasn't the one to pull the trigger. However, after that very weak first offence, the young Sadiatos quickly pulled herself together, bunching the ends of her trunk up into fists as she added,
"And while I don't condone such violence, if you see things from the perspective James describes, it was not an entirely unreasonable reaction. Dear friend was many times his size and approached him quite aggressively. He could have done very serious damage to a human if he actually attacked. And we both know he wasn't exactly a picture of
Agifionora! Magisteria interrupted her daughter with some clear indignation, apparently somewhat expecting that to shut her daughter down at least a little bit. However, Agifionora wasn't having it today.
"Don't Agifionora me,"
she replied more firmly now, though she still didn't raise her voice. Even if just briefly, they had both held the same position in the galaxy. They were peers now. She would not let her mother forget it.
"You cannot tell me I'm wrong. Even Auntie Apo knew not to take him to any events that would have too many off-worlders present to watch out for. Do you think James is stupid and didn't notice how tense everyone was around Dualfren?"
While her mother's head recoiled ever so slightly, as she seemingly wasn't quite sure how to react to her daughter stating the obvious so directly, Agifionora couldn't help but notice the other Nafmir Dualfren, tilting his head ever so slightly in an almost acknowledging sideways nod. Had she not been so suspicious of the man, she would have almost read it as a fair enough sort of gesture. After a few long moments of processing her daughter's words, Magisteria finally huffed.
"That's quite heavily simplified,"
she commented, sounding a bit cross, even if not openly aggressive.
"And even if it was exactly accurate, excusing the murder of a dignitary on his own soil, acting in self-defense is not murder,"
Agifionora immediately disagreed with.
"With a size difference of around 100 times, I can see how one might react extremely if they see a bull charging at one of their own."
In the corner of her vision, she saw the two bulls at the table look at each other directly, for the first time since the meal began. Neither of them looked upset, they just gave each other a quick, acknowledging glance that seemed almost a bit proud at their size, even if that was pretty inappropriate given the current topic. Magisteria dropped the fork briefly so both ends of her trunk would be free to quickly reach up and massage the space between her foremost eyes.
"They wouldn't have made that lapse in judgment were they not aiming weapons on our soil at our people," she said in an insistent tone. "It was a deliberate attack." "That's not what James says,"
Agifionora quickly replied, though she fell silent after that as her mother stared directly into her eyes in an expression that was strange to her. There was both anger and hurt there, which was about what she expected. However, she hadn't expected it in this specific mixture.
"And you believe him?"
the matriarch asked, with a voice that was entirely devoid of tone. It was a completely empty question that did nothing but demand an answer. The genuineness of the question momentarily had Agifionora taken aback a bit, and she wondered if someone who knew she was in the wrong could truly ask so honestly. However, she was quick to remember what she had seen and heard with her own eyes and ears, and the events that she herself had lived through. With a huffing exhale out of her trunk, she firmly nodded her head.
"It doesn't make sense to think he has somehow been coerced into doing the things he does," she replied with conviction, and not a hint of doubt in her mind. "He is going too far for that. He is too passionate. He puts too much of himself into this."
Her mother simply took her answer in. She then hummed after a moment, seemingly buying herself a bit more time to process with that sound. HFY expected her to get angry, or at least more upset in some other way. However, the matriarch did not do that. Instead, she brought her trunk down onto the table and crossed one end over the other as she looked at her daughter almost candidly.
"And you are truly in the fold of his allies now?"
she then asked, suddenly shifting the topic completely.
"He trusted you enough to install you as the direct inheritor of his position. Had you decided not to play along, his entire plan would have fallen apart, so he must have put a great deal of confidence in you. How far do your connections go in his faction?"
HFY was admittedly surprised by the change of direction the conversation had taken, and so it took her a moment to answer. That moment was elongated further as she needed a moment to think about how honest she wanted to be here. But ultimately, she didn't see any direct reason to be secretive in any way, especially since most of their interactions were possibly going to be made public anyway.
"I don't know any of them too well. In fact, the only one I have any sort of closer relationship to is James,"
she therefore replied honestly, folding her own trunk on the table as well.
"However, they have all been perfectly pleasant to work with during the brief time we have interacted. None of them are violent ruffians or core world-hating lunatics. Despite the tensions many of them have with our people, I have been welcomed like anyone else."
Magistheria nodded and then tilted her large head to the side a bit, with the constant flapping of her ears slowing down a bit.
"Is that so?"
she asked, and her curiosity at least appeared to be genuine.
"And did you talk to his more peculiar ally as well?"
HFY could tell that peculiar was truly the most polite word that her mother had found it in herself to come up with here. Of course, she knew this question was coming at some point, even if she had been very unsure of how exactly it was going to be asked, and for what purpose. It was really hard for her to imagine what her mother's exact thoughts on that situation were going to be. Releasing a slow exhale, she nodded once more.
"I have certainly had the opportunity to speak to her, Veselong,"
she confirmed at first, before her demeanour turned a bit more hesitant, as she had to add,
"though I have admittedly not made any extensive use of that chance. Not to the degree some of the others have, at least."
To her great internal dismay, her mother's face remained almost entirely unreadable as she took in that information. At this point, she almost would have preferred if she got mad at her.
"It is a unique opportunity,"
the matriarch simply replied in a completely passive manner. Then she quickly shook her head.
"But that is enough interrogating you,"
she said, her tone shifting to a softer one that HFY was more used to from her mother, that however felt slightly out of place in this current conversation, even if she appreciated his presence.
"I am sure you must have some questions as well. Sorry for being so overbearing."
HFY couldn't help but feel a bit of an aching in her heart, as her mother transitioned so easily back into her usual nurturing role that she had known since her childhood. It hurt her that she couldn't help but question if it was just an act. And if it was, had it always been?
"I guess I do have one question,"
she still got out, managing to not make her heartache too obvious as she spoke. She looked directly into her mother's eyes and tried her best to appear as open as she managed to so easily pretend to be.
"If you really do believe that James maliciously killed my father, and you are holding it against him, then why have you been one of those who openly endorsed him for his place in the council?"
Magistheria exhaled and lowered her gaze for a moment. She moved her head in a way that indicated that she understood the question well, and she lifted her trunk up with both ends wrapped around each other.
"Well, it's like this," she said, once she had filled her lungs back up after expelling all the air inside them.
She then pointed the entwined ends of her trunk at her daughter while making eye contact once again.
"Sometimes you have to do what is right, even if you don't like it."
Although Ajif and Nora generally agreed with that statement, she could feel a bit of a shiver run down her back as she looked back at her mother and allowed those words to sink in. Just what did she mean in this context? Glasses of many sizes clinked against each other as the timer finally ticked down to 0. As if to join in on the celebratory jubilation, all the messaging devices that were laid out neatly on the large podium simultaneously began to vibrate and alert in perfect synchronicity as the all-important message was sent out to nearly every person in the galaxy at exactly the same time. Nobody even needed to look at it to know what it entailed. The first phase of the election had come to an end. "About time if you ask me," Adme commented, as he poured his glass away from the toast and brought it to his lips to take a tentative sip. Of course, alcohol was out of the question in their current situation, but at least they had Finn Krieger's finest diamond water to celebrate with. "Soon enough, no one will be able to hide behind their damn immunity anymore." While he closed his eyes to take a long sip from the needlessly fancy glass, he suddenly jolted a bit as his arm was nudged heavily by an elbow, which almost made him spill his drink. "Hey," he said, opening his eyes again and snapping his gaze over to the perpetrator of the sudden attack. However, his mood shifted from annoyance to confusion, as he realized that not just Tuya, but basically everyone in the circle of humans was glaring at him with nasty expressions. He blinked briefly, very obviously confused about what he had said, but not quite willing to ask it directly. However, reading his confusion, Athena soon enough nodded in James's direction, leading Amit to look over at his ex, with his confusion still lasting a few more seconds. But then the penny seemed to finally drop, as his eyes opened a bit wider. "I didn't mean," he quickly began to say. However, James lifted his hand to stop him. "No, you're right," he quickly said, in an attempt to calm both Admir as well as everyone currently glaring at him. "No one will be able to hide anymore, and we can finally drag them into a process where everything will have to be laid open." He sighed a bit. This wasn't the first time he had found himself faced with this prospect. After all, this entire election had only started as a gesture of good faith. Back then, he had technically already lost. Therefore, he felt at peace with what was to come. He had seen it coming for a long time, after all. Even if he was going to be out of the picture soon, he could at least do his absolute best to make sure that they would have laid the groundwork so things could continue without him until then. He looked around the room where almost all the people who were in this with him had come together. Levexar, Ajaxier, and Morgoth were all standing together, amping each other up as they watched their names officially appear on the ballot for the election's second phase. Tharavel was butting her head against Konglorch, while rearing up slightly to push her weight against him, seemingly enjoying it that she had someone her own size and demeanour around to roughhouse a bit, in order to get some of the excited energy out. Konglorch was a good sport about it, and held against her pushes, just enough to offer noticeable resistance. Losarana had once again found himself drawn to the Zodiatos pair, now also joined by Moore and Quiz, as all those of a tenderer spirit came together to celebrate the moment and discuss what was to happen next. Nicola and Simon had pulled Finn to the side for a quick interview, using him as a jumping-off point to spread the image of those who came together here to the galaxy, since he was already a familiar face on their platform, even if that came from an entirely different context. Zisha D, as the last one of them to still hold the position of acting councilman, stood together with a group of those higher up the totem pole, such as the Admiral, Coco, Jirinora, and yes, even Shida. Despite ongoing celebrations over the passing of the first major hurdle, their conversation appeared to be quite a bit more directly restrained and strategic, though James had no doubt that at least some of them would join up with the merrier side of things soon enough. "You don't have to do this, you know," Someone close to him suddenly spoke up, causing James to return his attention to the group around him. Andrzej leaned forwards, his elbow supported on the knees of his crossed legs as his crimson eyes looked at James directly. His long hair hung loosely over his shoulders, and his forehead was showing a few scrunched wrinkles as he focused on his former protege. James slowly exhaled against his teeth in a way that caused a hissing sound, and he closed his eyes for a second. Once there was just about enough air for a single sentence left in his lungs, he nodded. "Yeah, I know," he confirmed with the last remaining air, before leaving his lungs empty for a few heartbeats. Then he inhaled again, but not greedily so. He did it in a slow, controlled manner. Only once his lungs were full again, a few seconds later, did he add, "But that's what I committed to a long time ago." He lifted his arms into a shrug, which then quickly turned into an extensive stretch that caused his back and organic shoulder to pop slightly. "I can't go back on that now," he said once his stretching session was over, and he felt a bit loosened up. "Why not?" Athena asked him in a surprisingly confrontational tone. Well, maybe it wasn't quite so surprising given that it was coming from her. James perked up a bit as he looked back at her, wondering what that was supposed to mean. "Why not?" he repeated, adding a confused tinge to his tone. He felt like it was pretty obvious why he couldn't go back on a promise that he had basically made day one. Still, the gaze of Athena's blue eyes was intense as she shook her head in a way that made her long ponytail swing like a pendulum behind it. "Buzz, I don't think anyone wants to see you do this," she said, putting extra emphasis on the word anyone. "Most of the people respect you, and the people who do want you in jail don't want you in jail for the stuff you've actually done. So much has happened that at this point, it will be a pretty empty gesture." James briefly glanced around to the other faces surrounding him. Although they didn't all make it obvious, most of them seemed to be in agreement with what she said. And, well, it wasn't like he himself couldn't see where they were coming from. If the tables were turned here, he would likely think the exact same way as they did. Admittedly, the idea did enter his mind that he was simply being stubborn, that he had made up his mind about something a long time ago and was simply sticking to it now without really considering the alternatives for all they were worth. Still, despite all that, his gut feeling told him the exact same thing it had always said. "It's not about the optics," he said, doing his best to not make that statement sound condescending. He lifted his hand to scratch the back of his head. "I know it's really weird to say since I'm heading to a really unpleasant time, but I'm mostly doing this for me." Although he wouldn't have held it against them, none of his teammates looked at him with any hint of confusion. Even without further explanation, which he had admittedly given in the past, they all seemed to understand his stance, even if they didn't necessarily disagree with it. He then let his hands sink down again and gave a slightly awkward smile. "Can you all please do me a favor and not try to convince me tonight?" he then requested with a chuckle. "Any other time, but not tonight." There was a bit of an oomph as a body suddenly leaned its weight against him, and James's head tilted slightly so he could look down at Nia, who laid her head on his shoulder. Her crutch was placed neatly at her side as she sat cross-legged, though now she was obviously tilted heavily to use him as a headrest. "It's your decision in the end," she said. Her eyes closed as she gently rubbed her head against him, a hint of slowly building exhaustion on her face. "Just know that we're all ready to throw hands if you decide that you don't want to go." James couldn't help but snort a bit before allowing his head to sink against that of his sister. "Yeah," he said, and closed his eyes as well. "I know." "Now remember," Sassatrix said as she walked in front of the camera with deliberately swaying steps, making full deliberate use of every asset she had in order to gain her audience's attention as she paraded around the council station. "You don't have to use every one of your votes. Unlike the first phase of the election, it is perfectly fine to just throw a handful of votes our way and say, screw everyone else. Your votes will be counted all the same, and only the total amount of votes per person matters in the end. So don't feel forced to go around and try to pick the least bad options out of a bunch of garbage. Every vote counts, and that means that every vote that those who want to shoot you on the streets do not get is a good one." Her way of speaking sure was a little more charged than that which the more level-headed dancers tended to use. Or maybe it was less of a case of being less level-headed, and more of a case of not needing to censor herself here. She had a hand raised to waggle it at the camera following her as she spoke, and every movement of hers was so voluptuous that it seemed like she was trying to perform her species' innate dance out for everyone to see. A slightly chirping laughter could be heard from his side, causing two of Conglorch's eyes to move over to focus on the grey form that was walking alongside him.
"She sure is energetic,"
Tharavel commented as she kept pace with the Tenashasite, both of them walking a few measures behind the bouncy dancer and her conscientious cameraman. The Parasine's yellow eyes looked out from behind the natural mask that grew out of her beak with an endeared expression as she watched how the dancer put on her little show. Conglorch bellowed slightly as another of his eyes followed her gaze.
"She is, but it is deliberate,"
he said, his tongue briefly gliding along his teeth.
"Do not mistake her nature for childishness. You might be surprised at the intent behind her every move."
Tharavel clacked her beak a couple of times as she turned her head to shift her gaze towards him instead.
"So astute, Venahasari,"
she complimented, in a way that didn't make it entirely clear if she was mocking him or not.
"It seems like your occupation doesn't just come from nowhere."
Conglorch was unsure of how annoyed he should be, because it truly sounded like she could both be mocking him or be genuinely impressed. Though maybe he should be just as annoyed as her being impressed that he could make such a simple observation.
"In a way, she is Venahasari too,"
he commented, deciding to simply not invest any emotions into the candidate's words.
"I can see what you mean,"
Tharavel concurred with him, taking a brief glance at the dancer again before shaking herself a bit.
"And I must admit, it is slightly strange to have such a spectacle made out of a simple shopping trip of mine."
Conglorch rolled his shoulders a bit.
"Publicity is and has always been a huge part of politics,"
he said, though he had little doubt that Tharavel already knew that.
"A carnival candidate, at least one that is to be taken seriously, is enough of a sensation that it is worth to shine a spotlight on it, and the fact that there are barely any meat vendors on the entire council station, so that actually getting food is such a trip for you, is something that can be spun into a narrative."
Tharavel made another chirping giggle sound.
"Well, it's not like we couldn't just have gotten some food from the humans,"
she commented, as the whiskers on the back of her head wiggled gently through the air. Conglorch's maw opened a bit wider, revealing his teeth more visibly to the world around him, while another deep bellow escaped from his chest.
"Cloned meat, yes. Something that the carnivores of the galaxy still struggle to understand and accept, even if they are in support of James," he commented, elaborating a bit on the idea for a narrative he had in mind. "What they will, however, be able to relate to is the desire to acquire genuine meat instead, as well as the lengths one might be willing to go to acquire it." While his amusement at the relatable situation was real, his tone and expression faltered a bit as he spoke of genuine meat. A brief flash of blood and broken ivory flashed before his inner eye, though he quickly shook it off so heavily that his plates rattled against each other.
"I think I see what you mean,"
Tharavel replied, either not noticing his momentary slip or politely ignoring it. Suddenly, one of the Tenashasite's constantly scanning eyes spotted some stirring among the ever-present human soldiers, watching the every move of all the new candidates under their watch. A brief adjustment of where he was looking quickly showed him the cause of their reaction. A lumbering form was moving right to their protective formation. A long neck poked out of a heavily swaying shell, while its owner walked on all fours, a clubbed tail swinging behind them in an arch that was a bit too wide to be considered careful. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to stand back." The leading figure of the closest team of humans engaged with the approaching figure, which earned him a heavily scorning look from half-lidded eyes.
"You cannot block my way!"
The old Korstilch immediately spoke up, his head rising up into the air on a mildly trembling neck.
"I can go where I want! Who gave the likes of you the right to try and cage me?"
As he indignantly complained, the visibly overgrown claws on his front feet were drumming on the floor. Still, seeing as the man had stopped, the human soldier continued to handle the situation professionally. "I am sorry for the inconvenience, but after recent events, security measures have increased around the Canadas under our watch," he informed in a sober manner. "You will be able to pass here in just a moment." At this, the old tortoise huffed heavily, with the nostrils on his forehead flowing into dark circles. "Security measures? Are you implying I am a danger? You of all people!" the old man exclaimed and reared up onto his hind legs, quickly towering over the human as he rose to his full height, his clubbed tail now functioning as a counterweight that kept him upright. "Look at the people you are protecting! They are the danger, and you—" He bowed his head down to squint his eyes at the human directly. You can't wait for an excuse to use that against me, don't you?" he said, very nearly growled, his eyes dashing down to the soldier's weapons. "You're already salivating at the thought of taking me down so you and your pack can gorge yourself on my flesh." As he spoke, his voice slowly turned from a growl to a breathy hiss, as if he was forcing every word out without having the necessary air in his lungs, which also caused him to drag the words out much longer. "Why not do it?" he said, every utterance sounding like gas escaping a leaking pipe. "Why try to hide your true nature? Why put on the guise of civility? You're the strong, aren't you? And we are all but livestock that you can't wait to lead to slaughter." Conglorch's fine eyes could see how the human's stance shifted backwards ever so slightly to grant him the tiniest bit of distance from the man's insane ramblings, but overall he stood his ground. "I will ask you again, sir. Please back off," he stated, in a determinately calm tone, clearly not willing to even dignify the accusations. The old man's head pulled back from the soldier, though in the movement, it spotted those he was guarding against. "What about you?" he asked loudly over the human's head, which the size difference made hard to prevent. The old tortoise's gaze was intense as he focused on the two predators, who were much more his own size. "You must have not had a good meal in a while, did you? You can't stand the horrendous gruel the humans try to feed you with, can you? Cheap! Unnatural! Disgusting!" he ranted on, and once again his words started to become breathy, as if keeping breath support of even a few sentences was difficult for him. Although he and Tharaval were both predators, the old man focused on Conglorch specifically, especially at the large dagger-like teeth in his mouth. "You would love to crush my shell, wouldn't you? To feel it crack under your bite? To get at my soft insides?" He kept up his tirade, and although it was clearly accusatory, the old man was so far off the trail that it almost sounded like he himself was actually wishing for that to happen. And although he was obviously teetering on the brink of insanity, the unfortunate circumstances sadly led to his words hitting far closer to home than they had any right to. As he talked about the cracking of his shell, Conglorch's jaw began to quiver as his stomach churned, memory after memory chasing through his mind. The cracking of ivory, the feeling of cut flesh, the sound of gurgling, the taste of blood, the sight of light slowly leaving a pair of blue eyes. The Tenashasite retched for a moment as the world around him became blurry, reality and memories merging to the point that he could briefly not distinguish between them anymore. Suddenly, his arm was grabbed by something, and in a purely instinctive reaction, his head shot around to snap at the perceived attacker. Luckily, the Parasine was more than fast enough to pull out of the way of the sluggish lashing out, though the shot that she even had to dodge was evident in her eyes. Conglorch breathed heavily, his stomach twisting even more as he realized what he had done. Still, he was back in reality. He saw what was in front of him again. And once that much became clear to Tharavel based on his gauge, she quickly seized his arm again and began to swiftly pull him away from the old Korostilch. Although she wasn't quite as massive as the Tenashasite himself, she was still more than large and strong enough to move him when he didn't offer any resistance. Conglorch allowed her to drag him a good distance away, while the old man himself was held at bay by a fraction of their human accompaniment. Luckily, Conglorch's ears were ringing too much for him to hear any more of his insane ranting. He did, however, hear it as Tharavel spoke up again.
That was Acting Councilman Kashalangas,
she mumbled, her beak clacking after her words as if she closed it a bit too fast.
Goodness, he looked awful.
Konglosh growled slightly. At first he was afraid to speak since he feared that his stomach would empty itself as soon as he opened his mouth. However, after a bit of walking, he felt like he had pulled himself together enough to actually reply. Maybe he was dropped by those who kept him in check after he became too much of a liability, he wondered, taking a few deep breaths to suppress his gag reflex.
That, or a changing world, was really just too much for him,
Tharavel concurred. Then she looked up, the look in her eyes changing a bit as she switched to a more light-hearted tone while adding,
But how old does he think he is? He's acting like the last couple of 100,000 years or so of evolution didn't happen.
The bellowing engine in Konglosh's chest started up again at her attempt to cheer him up, though he didn't quite have the capacity to add a witty comment yet. Still, it seemed like Tharavel was satisfied with the success of her jest, as she briefly puffed out her feathers.
Are you all right?
She asked him, her voice becoming calmer and more serious again. Not really, but I'll be okay for now, Konglosh replied. Then one of his scanning eyes spotted the sign of the vendor they had been looking for in the distance, and his stomach once again gave a small twist. But you might have to eat alone.